never happened before. So now, please join me in welcoming former Vice President Al Gore and climate change policy expert Tina Johnson.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Al Gore, for a wonderful, wonderful film and for the incredible work that you've been doing on climate change. I know that I personally want to thank you for just the efforts that you've put forward to make sure that we have a planet and a home and a community that can actually be proud of what we do here as American citizens to move forward and to fight for the things that we really feel committed to, which is a planet that is safe and clean and good for everyone. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you very much. I appreciate all the great work you've done, including in your last gig at the Climate Action Network. And if I may take the opportunity to do so, I thought I was going to be up here with the directors also, and I want to make sure that everybody knows that the people who really made this movie are Bonnie Cohen and John Chink, and they're here somewhere in back, and I want you to give them the credit for this movie. And our two producers, Diane Wireman and Richard Burge, who are also here, I want to give them the credit also. Thank you. And I want to acknowledge with a lot of gratitude, all of you who've come, thank you. And the ones who are in the atrium, if they can see us and hear us, I hope and expect they can. Thank you for all the people who are gathered outside the theater and watching in the atrium.
Great. So let's just get started with this film. It's the second film to An Inconvenient Truth. And you titled it An Inconvenient Truth, the sequel, Truth to Power. And I think that title is very fitting because it is the work of speaking truth to power that's necessary. And I would really like for you to dig into this question around the relevancy of this film at the time in which it was done, 2015, the Paris Agreement. The world is watching, we do this amazing thing. And then fast forward. We have our U.S. election, and we get a new president who is not part of the collective energy and ideology around a planet for all. And what you think about that transition compared to where the film is and where we are right now.
Yeah, well, you know, the role of truth as determined by the masses of the self-governing literate who have the opportunity to engage in free discourse and test what's more likely to be true than not. That's really the bedrock of democracy and self-government. And we now have a wave of populist authoritarianism, not only as represented by Donald Trump, but also Erdogan in Turkey and Duterte in the Philippines and Orban in Hungary and Putin, and this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. And I don't think we should take the time to go into the reasons why this has emerged, but hyperglobalization and intelligent automation and the capture of tax policy and regulatory policy by elites, all these factors and others have led to a 4-decade stagnation of middle-income wages. And of course people have become really upset even as income inequality has grown and much more income and wealth has gone up the ladder to the top tier. And that sets the stage for people to say, wait a minute, this isn't working for me. And so our country was vulnerable to what happened last year. And by the way, I don't want to give you the impression that I'm just automatically assuming that everybody in this audience agrees with me on all political questions. I get it. I know there are a lot of Republicans here, and I also assume that there are more than a few that actually have supported Trump. There was a real impulse to turn over the table, 52 card pickup, let's just start fresh and try something new. I get that. But it's not working real well, and at least in my opinion. And so where the climate crisis is concerned, my idea is that he's allowed himself to be captured by these carbon polluters, and it's too bad. But that's not the end of the story, because I was very worried when he made his announcement that he was pulling out of Paris. I feared other countries might use that as an excuse to also pull out. But I was so happy the very next day the entire rest of the world stood up and said, nah, we're still in. We're going to abide by the Paris Agreement. And in fact, a whole lot of countries actually doubled down, as if, in physics there's that old law, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. I think the reaction to Trump is really strong and growing, by the way. And I think on climate we've had that too. And this state, Jerry Brown is a hero in the climate movement. California has done a fantastic job. New York State, Washington State, Oregon, Vermont, a bunch of other states, hundreds of cities, thousands of businesses. The U.S. is on track now to exceed the commitments made in the Paris Agreement. So Trump was a setback, but we're going to prevail in spite of him. We need to make progress faster than we're making it now. And with a president who is really committed to this, we could. But look, we've got to win this no matter what. I mean, whatever the obstacles are, we have no choice. You can't curl up and feel despair. It doesn't do any good. So we just have to build a much larger grassroots movement, and that's happening on its own.
Yep, thank you for that. And I think one of the things that you mentioned that is really important is the grassroots and the movement forward and the urgency around addressing climate change. And in the film, you do a lot of linking climate impact. So you use Syria, you use the drought from the Fertile Crescent, and then you look at the impacts in the Philippines and how that overall culmination of travesty, in a sense, is really driving forward this global idea that we actually have to act on climate change in a more urgent way. And I think that, for me at least, and probably for the audience, how do we continue that momentum for urgency with Jerry Brown's leadership? We have the summit coming up in California in September and other areas throughout the world that are actually moving towards that. But what are the other pockets of opportunity that you see for us to be able to push for urgency and on acting on climate change?
Well, I think there are three. First of all, the climate-related extreme weather events, unfortunately, are obviously getting worse. And there are two things new since the first movie a decade ago. The extreme events are worse, and the good news is we have the solutions now. But Mother Nature is a very powerful and persuasive participant in this debate now. And by the way, you talked about the Philippines and places around the world. We don't have to go very far from this theater. The Thomas Fire is now officially the largest fire in the entire history of the state of California. In December, 3.5 weeks ago. Last year was the worst fire year in the history of California. Hurricane Harvey dumped 5 feet of rain on New Orleans. Hurricane Irma destroyed Puerto Rico. Half the people still don't have electricity. It's shameful and disgraceful that we've left those American citizens in a state of such horrible distress. the Caribbean islands. I mean, I could go on with the list. Every night on the national news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. And I think that people are connecting the dots on their own, even if the news media, for whatever reason, is too timid and scared to really talk about climate very much. So I think that's one powerful impetus for continued momentum. Secondly, we have this, you could almost say heaven sent, new opportunity to use solar electricity and wind electricity at ever lower prices because miraculously, well, it's due to the hard work of technologists and business executives and investors, but we have seen that the incredible phenomena that we got used to with the computer industry, they get half as cheap every couple of years, that now characterizes renewable energy. And it's beginning to characterize batteries and electric vehicles and efficiency improvements. And as a result, the entire world is in the early stages of a sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the industrial revolution, but the speed of the digital revolution. We're getting the ability to manage electrons and molecules and atoms with the same precision that the information companies have used in managing bits of information. And it's creating higher levels of efficiency, decoupling CO2 and economic progress. And it's worldwide, it's sweeping the world. You saw in the story of the conservative Republican Trump supporting mayor of Georgetown, Texas, in the heart of oil country, happens to be a CPA and he's good with arithmetic. And so he says, oh, we can save our citizens money and the air is cleaner. It's kind of a side benefit that we're helping to save the future of humankind. So that's a big impetus. And third, young people are as different on this issue as they were on marriage equality and in my generation, civil rights, where some of us who are older, not me, I'm quick to add, who were, the older people were kind of debating marriage equality. And the younger generation was saying, what the hell are you waiting for? This is ridiculous. And 5 years ago, if somebody told me in the year 2018, gay marriage would be fully legal in all 50 states and honored, accepted, and celebrated by more than 2/3 of the American people, I would have said, well, I sure hope so, but what are you smoking? That's just not going to happen so quickly, but it did. And I think that this new wave of awareness among young people is a third source of momentum and progress.
So as we think through that momentum and that progress, young people, and you have technology innovation and the fact that a lot of folks are just doing the simple math, it makes sense. Yeah. It does make sense for us to do more and to act more urgently here. From a personal, one of the scenes in the documentary that really touched me was, actually there are two. One, when you were speaking to Congress and you said, if I could just take you alone and talk to you. And then the other was when you were standing there and you got really fired up and you were just like, how long is it going to take? What are we going to say to the next generation? I would like for you to share with us that personal journey that you've been on to get here. Because you're still doing this. You're still doing the fighting. And you're not, pardon me, you're not young, right? But you're still out there. But you're out there with the heart of a young person.
I told them to cut those scenes out of the movie.
But no, your heart and your passion is that of a young person. It's someone who's looking at just not the now, but the beyond. And I think that's a really important part of this story. That I would like for you to, where do you get that from, that drive? What is that vision that keeps pushing you and pulling you?
Well, thank you for asking. That's really interesting as a question. And I'm not sure I know how to answer it. I couldn't not do this. I feel like it's an enormous privilege to have work to do that makes you feel like it justifies pouring every bit of energy you have into it. That's a blessing. It's a source of joy to me. And the work itself gives me energy. I love my work. There's a lot of danger that we're facing in this world. There are a lot of opportunities, and using the opportunities to overcome the dangers. If I felt like, you know, I'm going to take the day off and just, you know, goof off. Well, sometimes I do that, of course, but my point is, I don't want to use the word driven because it doesn't feel like I'm being driven by something. I'm being pulled into it. I don't know, it sounds weird for me to talk this way, but I'm trying to answer your question honestly. I just couldn't imagine not doing it. I was fortunate as a very young man when I was a senior in college in the 1960s to have the opportunity to learn from one of the greatest environmental scientists ever in history, a Californian named Roger Revelle, who was the first person to measure CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. And he opened my eyes to this a long time ago. I really respected him so much. I kept in touch with him, and 7 years after I graduated, I was elected to the U.S. Congress, and I asked what's going on with global warming, and nothing was going on. And I got permission from one of my subcommittee chairs to organize the first hearing in the Congress on climate. And I invited that then senior professor to come and be the lead-off witness. And I was so excited. I thought all my colleagues on the dais would hear him and have the same epiphany that I'd had, and it just didn't happen that way. And of course, it was stupid on my part because a 20-minute statement to Congress is not a full college course. And maybe there were some other factors too, but that's the first time that I began to ask myself the question, how can this be communicated effectively? So much is at stake. How can I help to reproduce the aha moment that he had given me? And so that began my journey. I never imagined for a minute this would take over my life and that this would be what I devoted my life to. But I do feel it's a privilege to have the opportunity to do this work.
Well, it's a privilege that you're a part of it and doing it so well. I want to open it up to the audience for questions. And so I see a hand here. I have some runners that are going to bring microphones. Can you stand up and ask?
Hi. First, I want to thank you for being here and for making the sequel to the first film. I saw it at the ripe old age of 12 and gave me a wake-up call to enter the sustainability industry.
Great. Thank you. Good.
So my question for you is, when I first saw the film, I knew that we had to do something, and now, 12 years later, people are still asking how they are still not, I guess, on board with climate change. And I'm wondering, in 12 years from now, what you see the next frontier for the sustainability industry being.
Yeah. Well, there was a famous economist in the last century named Rudy Dornbush who said, things take longer to happen than you think they will. And then they happen much faster than you thought they could. And that inflection point is where I think we are right now with the climate crisis. I mentioned the cost reduction curves for renewable energy, for example, and you also saw that in the Georgetown, Texas part of the movie. When it gets enough cheaper than fossil fuels, then it's completely unstoppable. And I mentioned before what I see happening worldwide with this sustainability revolution. Based on that and other factors, I would answer you by saying I think, 10, 12 years from now, and really before that, we're going to see a very dramatic change. You used the figure 12 years. India, since the Paris Agreement, India has done a complete about-face. They've closed 37 coal mines this year. They're shutting down a bunch of coal-burning power plants. And they've just announced that 12 years from now, 100% of all their new cars and trucks must, by law, be electric vehicles. They're moving faster than we are now. So last month, China began implementing a cap-and-trade program. We have seen a lot of countries announce the phase out of the internal combustion engine. Some countries, including France, have announced that they will, by a date certain, not allow any more exploration on their territory for fossil fuels. The largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which, by the way, was financed 100% by the gas and oil in the North Sea, they just, excuse me, they just announced that they are withdrawing 100% of all their investments in oil, gas, coal, tar sands, fossil fuels. Based on these and many other examples I could cite for you, I think that we are now entering a new phase, and I think we're in the part where it's going to happen faster than we thought it could.
I have a question. Red jacket on the right. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for presenting this new update. I was fortunate to ask you a question in 1992 in Rio. Now, 25 years later, I get another chance. Thank you. Back then, you admitted, or shall you put your own words to it, you did write and speak about the overpopulation on the planet. That is not being talked about as a factor in climate change.
Yeah.
Can you still address that?
Yeah, happy to.
And thank you.
Yeah, of course. There are some people who think there's some kind of quiet conspiracy not to bring population into this. I don't agree with that. I've written a whole bunch of books on the climate crisis, and I've written extensively on the population part of the issue every time. I think one reason why it is receiving, I hate to repeat Pat Moynihan's often ridiculed phrase, benign neglect. I think one of my favorite climate bloggers, Dave Roberts, wrote an article recently along these lines saying, why he's not hammering away on the population part of it. I'll tell you why I have dealt with it in books, but why it's not really a part of this movie. The population issue is actually, believe it or not, a success story unfolding in slow motion. We are seeing a dramatic change in the population dynamic of almost every country. And I don't want to get too geeky in this, but bear with me a moment. There is a well-known change that takes place from one equilibrium state to another. The first is large families, high death rates, and high birth rates. And then there's an S-curve, and the second equilibrium is small families, low birth rates, and low death rates. Every country in the world is on that path down to the second equilibrium state. Some have overshot it. You have population decline in places like Italy and Japan and Russia and a few other places. There are some that are just beginning that transition, and about a dozen countries in sub-Saharan Africa, some areas in South Asia, we're seeing a slower transition. But overall, and we know that how to induce that change. 4 things all have to be present. Education of girls, number 1. Empowerment of women to participate in the decisions of their families, communities, nations. Number 3, ubiquitous access to fertility management techniques and knowledge. I don't use the phrase birth control because in developing countries that's misunderstood. And then perhaps most important, continued reductions in child mortality. Because when parents have confidence that their children will survive into adulthood, then they are comfortable having smaller families. You put all 4 of those conditions present, automatically, almost automatically, you get this reduction to small families, low birth rates, low death rates. Now, the areas where this has been slower to take hold are going to be areas of real pressure on the environment, pressure on climate. Midway through this century, Africa, continent, not a country, but Africa will have more people than either China or India. And by the end of this century, more people than China and India combined. And the rich countries have not followed through on one of the four, making fertility management universally available. And that's partly a political issue. But I do think that it is, in the main, a success story unfolding in slow motion.
Great. The guy in front of my finger, will you stand up? Yep, you. Waving at me. Wait for the microphone.
How you doing, Vice President Gore? My name is Alex Merkelides. I'm a school teacher. I teach science. I also host a show called The Green Revolution Show, currently filming the first season. Not only would we love to have you on, I was lucky enough to meet you at the Roosevelt Island 4 weeks ago, but most importantly, I want to thank you for what you're doing. You're truly like awakening, and you did transcend the presidency, so I just want to thank you, say that again. And my question to you is, we have all these strategies for Paul Hawken, right? The 100 strategies to reverse global climate warming and trigger global climate cooling. What are the 3 strategies or a few basic strategies that we can take relatively soon that empower us, because it is such a big problem, right? You want to lobby your government, run for office. What are those 3 or a few of those basic strategies we can take to trigger global climate cooling and to empower us all, like, immediately?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for being a science teacher. God bless you. That's really a great profession. Use your voice, use your vote, use your choices. Win the conversations on climate. It's really important. I mentioned marriage equality. I could mention the civil rights movement before that. Those and other revolutions were won in conversations, and then the laws changed. Use your vote. 2018 is a big year, and 2020 is a big year. But use your vote, and use social media not only to win the conversation, but to get others to vote. And use your choices. When you are in a store making a choice, when you choose a climate-friendly alternative, it not only helps you be a part of the solution, it sends a powerful signal to the manufacturers, to the designers, to the wholesalers and retailers, and that's really driving business behavior. Now, on the policy front, we need to put a price on carbon because we're making ourselves blind to the full implications of the choices we make economically every day, every hour, every minute. If we decide, supply and demand is just magic and it's going to solve everything for us, but let's ignore all the environmental consequences. Let's tell every business, every corporation, everybody on Earth, if you've got gaseous waste, just use the sky as an open sewer. It's fine. No worries. Because the bill won't come due until, maybe tomorrow, but a big part of it not until the next generation. So we need to put a price on carbon to get that into our economic calculation. We need to stop subsidizing carbon-based fuels. On a global basis, we subsidize coal, oil, and gas 38 times more than solar and wind. It's ridiculous. So those are the things I'd rattle off first.
The woman, yes, you like this.
Thank you. My question is, what do you think about geoengineering to solve climate change on a planetary scale?
Well, I'm going to give you a straight answer, but I want to define the term first, because not everybody knows what you're talking about. And there actually is a range of things that are described as geoengineering. If you paint roofs white, some people say that's geoengineering. That's fine with me, no problem. if you want to put tinfoil strips orbiting the Earth to block out some of the incoming sunlight, that's officially insane. If you want to substitute for the tinfoil strips chemical compounds that also block out incoming sunlight, that's also insane, in my opinion. Now, there are other things in between. There are people who've tried to fertilize the ocean to grow more algae, and it worked. And then a few months passed, and the algae died, and it gave back all the CO2 that had been taken up. We don't yet know enough. We sometimes think we know more than we do, and there's a danger of hubris and imagining that we can come up with some unplanned global experiment that will magically cancel out the impacts of the unplanned global experiment we already have underway. It really worries me a lot. So the idea, I mean, the most often discussed and most controversial form of geoengineering is they've come up with some acronym, I guess, something sunlight management or something. Solar radiation management, SRM. Well, SRM, that sounds like it's normalized already. But to block out incoming sunlight, which is needed by plants for photosynthesis, by solar cells for making electricity, I kind of like the sky to be blue. Maybe that doesn't matter to people. But some scientist told me a long time ago, this is kind of a silly story, but here's what he told me. He said, imagine you've got a dozen people stranded on a lifeboat well offshore, and they're in trouble, and two guys go to the one end of the boat and start rocking the boat violently. And a couple of guys in the back are scientists, and they say, well, you know, technically it's possible to use these mirrors we have to signal to shore and direct the construction of a new wave generating machine which will generate waves that will precisely cancel out the rocking of the boat. Or we could get them to stop rocking the boat. And for us as a species to continue putting 110 million tons of destructive heat-trapping gaseous pollution into the sky as if it's an open sewer every 24 hours, and then say, what are we going to do about it? It's causing problems. What are we going to do? Oh, well, we can put some other stuff in the sky that will block out the sun's light, and we can do this, and we can... Stop using the sky as an open sewer. Stop putting all this stuff up there. That's what the solution is. Now, there are people who have respected voices, and I could rattle off a few of them, who have fallen into such despair about the ability of the world's political system to do the right thing on this, that they are driven to imagine some kind of science, geekotechnic way to counter the effects of it. You know, let's hear them out, but I think it's nuts.
We are out of time.
Oh, let's take one more. Let's say,
Okay.
I can't believe we're out of time.
Give him it's your time, so we can do that. Yes, your companion is being very strong here, so yes, you can have the floor.
My name is Eric. I'm in the Citizens Climate Lobby. Currently, the world has 65 million refugees, displaced persons. 30% of those are in Africa, as you mentioned, the fastest growing continent on the planet. And with the effects of climate change, that number is only going to continue to grow exponentially. Yeah. What are we going to do with all these displaced people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for being a part of that Citizens Climate Lobby. They do great work. So the movie you just saw tells the story of how the climate crisis is connected to the refugees flowing out of Syria. There was a study last year that predicts in this century there may be as many as 1 billion climate refugees coming from areas that are drought-stricken, areas that are devastated by drought and fire, floods. Well, look at Puerto Rico, devastated by a hurricane, and there have been, I don't know how many 100,000 people from Puerto Rico have become climate refugees already. And if that number grows to 1 billion, you know, what are we going to do? Well, we have to make plans to take care of these people. Welcome the stranger, welcome the refugee. That's what my faith tradition teaches me. But my political experience tells me that it's going to be a hell of a challenge for many political systems in the world. One of the reasons for this wave of populist authoritarianism I mentioned earlier in Europe, for example, is the anti-immigrant, you know, it gets to a certain level, then people who sometimes surprise you will say, whoa, that's too many, we've got to crank down. And so you get repercussions in the political world. You take even something like Brexit, you know, that's the thing that name they use for the United Kingdom in England, where they decide to vote to pull out of Europe. The most powerful billboard they had during that campaign was a billboard showing an endless line of refugees from the Middle East and North Africa at the gates of Europe. And it said, Europe, the EU has failed us. This is a very destabilizing political force that we ignore at our peril. But, I mean, India has already completed the largest steel fence in the world on its southern border with Bangladesh, because the refugees from the southern part of the delta areas of Bangladesh, you know, the same week Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston, 1/3 of Bangladesh was underwater. We had 50 centimeters over and above the normal monsoon in South Asia, and it's getting worse on a regular basis. So you're dead on in calling attention to this, and the world's political leaders need to wake up and realize they're going to be in a world of hurt if we don't forestall the rapid development of this crisis. Now let me say, since it appears we've run out of time, I want to call attention again to Bonnie Cohen and John Schenck, and I want to say to you, and some of you here are from the movie industry, I'm pretty biased in my assessment of what Bonnie and John have done. But if you step back and think, you know, the incredibly dangerous parts of this threat, that's a hard story to tell right there. The incredibly hopeful opportunities that we now have available to solve it. The political momentum in Paris. Trump comes to power. Then the rest of the world and most of the U.S. says, well, we're not going to let him stop us. We're going to keep moving. All those elements in one story, compressed and entertaining, that's an awesome task. And it's not for me to brag on what they've done, but I've just done it anyway. And the one element, I'll close with this, that what has resulted is a depiction of reality. This is the world we're facing now, and we've got to solve this. I think we will. But the one element we most need is political will to take the solutions and put them in effect to solve the crisis. Now, political will is itself a renewable resource, but the mission and purpose of this movie you've just seen is precisely that, to help renew the political will that we need to solve this crisis. So I want to thank Bonnie and John and Diane and Richard and all the people that worked on this movie. And Tina, thank you for talking with me on stage here. I appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate the time and the opportunity. I think for the end of this, the thing that I take away from this and you take away from this is that your voice matters, your vote matters, and if we really want to do something about climate change, we have to be willing to act and get beyond our base and our narrative that we speak to each other as climate fighters, to let people know that this really does matter, and that's what this film does, and that's what you're doing. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.